Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and a slightly confused clock thanks to my inability to process international time zones properly. So if you're joining, if you've been hanging around for an hour, then I thank you for hanging around for an hour. We've been enjoying the extra time, making sure that the studio setup is perfect and so on. My name's Don Robinson, and you are, of course, listening to SM Advanced Forum, your monthly roundup of the news and latest views and opinions of some of the esteemed members of the community on the topics of the day in the streaming industry. I am, of course, joined as always, by Tim Siglin. Tim, are you out there? Just unlock
unfortunately, Dom, the world is not behind me today, but I am here. Enjoyed Halloween. I found out that you can apparently, if you go out with small children and do trick-or-treating, you can invoke what's called the parent tax, even if you're not a parent, and get candy for free. So,
and that comes with a free shot of insulin afterwards, does it? What have you been up to, Tim? Anyway, where have you been? You've been around the world,
so
conferences and things?
One of the conferences that I went to was NAB New York. And alongside that, AES, which is the Audio Engineering Society, helping a company come out of stealth mode. We we did a pop-up banner for the company. Turned out to be 10 feet tall instead of 6 feet tall, but we were right next to T-Mobile. Actually got some interest from T-Mobile and a couple other companies, so that's good. Been traveling a little bit. Was out in San Francisco for some meetings the last few days, and was supposed to go to Argentina today, but have opted to wait to do that until after Streaming Media West, which you and I should talk a little bit about West during the
wrap up at the end. Yeah, absolutely. So how was the NAB conference? Was it good?
You know, NAB New York has always been a radio show. It's always tied to AES. AES is a 3-day show, and NAB is a 2-day show. We actually opted from a booth standpoint to go on the AES side because A, it was half the price, B, it was more trafficked than the NAB show. There was the streaming summit that Dan hosted, and there seemed to be a fair number of people there for that. But overall, the show floor at NAB New York was much quieter than the AES side of the house. A number of companies that we would know and love, including people we've had on here as guests before, helped sponsored that. But the biggest presence on the NAB New York side was actually New Tech with their NDI technology. And that's primarily because what NAB seems to be trying to do is turn that into a production show instead of a radio show.
Right. Okay. That sounds interesting. I wonder if that reflects changes in the market or just where they want to go. Interesting.
I think where they want to go, not necessarily changes in the market. It still feels like half radio, half video, but give it a year or two and let's see where it goes.
Cool, excellent. Unfortunately, I have to give apologies from our normal co-host, Eric Schumacher-Rasmussen, the editor of Streaming Media. He unfortunately is in a flight at the moment. He might try to connect to us, but if he does, I should imagine it's going to be very blocky and pixelated. So we'll just imagine he's here in spirit.
In the States, it's actually illegal to use it to do streaming or phone calls, not to receive streams, but to actually try to video call out. So if he does try to join us,
Why is that?
No idea. I think it's one of those models that they say at first they wouldn't let you even stream content in. And then what they started doing is charging you an extra price to stream content in. So I think it's very much a market dynamic as opposed to this is a problem.
Right. It's probably because a VSAT alignment upstream is probably, oh no.
Yeah, probably. Anyway. So we can talk about that.
We'll put that to the guests in a minute. So Tim, why don't you take us? Oh no, and Mark, of course, Paul Mark East is overworked and under available today. So Mark is doing something like 15 simultaneous webcasts in 3 different parts of the West.
You can't exactly say he's underpaid because if he's doing 15 webcasts simultaneously, his company's 090 is doing quite well. So.
Yeah, I don't know if it's 15, but maybe it's 20. I don't want to cut him short there. Excellent. But anyway, Tim, take us to our real guest this week because obviously we have.
Actually, I'm going to start with Sangeeta. Sangeeta, introduce yourself. Just tell us who you are and what company you're with, and just a brief background on you, and then we'll come back around with some questions in a few minutes.
Hi, Tim. Sure. I'm Sangeeta Ramakrishnan, a distinguished engineer at Cisco Systems, based here in Silicon Valley. I've been at Cisco for a while. My background has been in cable, DOCSIS, streaming video, and a little bit in the mobile and Wi-Fi space too, and more recently in the machine learning space and how to help improve our products by leveraging the data we have available to us.
Interesting. Were you part of Scientific Atlanta before Cisco during that acquisition?
No, actually, I came into Cisco through its first service provider video acquisition in the late 90s, VBits. We built one of the first 2 statistical remultiplexer products in the industry. So I was working on the translating, transcoding products, and in fact wrote the first StatMux.
Very nice. All right, Rory, tell us about yourself. I don't think I've seen you since Streaming Forum in Europe, but bring us up to speed on what you're doing these days.
Sure. Hey, I'm Rory McVicar. So I head up our IP, CDN, and interconnection products in EMEA for CenturyLink. Prior to that, I worked at Level 3. So I'm a recently acquired person in the telco space. At Level 3, I was managing our CDN and Vivix products, so our broadcast IP transmission services over our backbone. Prior to that, I've had a bit of a magical mystery tour to get to where I've been. So my college degree was in filmmaking, and I was always passionate about creativity and technology. And I sort of am of the generation where I've seen things move very, very quickly as to how people interact and tell stories. This medium through which we are currently conversing being central to that. So I left college with a film degree, had aspirations of becoming a film editor, worked as a film editor, saw a transition to tapeless, HD, all of those things that the broadcast world knows and loves. And through association with some of the people that I worked with in that sphere, I broke away and formed part of a startup called A-Frame, which was a crazy harebrained scheme to try and create some sort of professional Dropbox for video. So that was around 10 years or so ago, 9 years or so ago. And we built that up. And through building that business, I saw that all of the broadcast customers were becoming interconnection and connectivity customers, networking customers. And they sort of didn't realize it was happening stealthily beneath their very feet. So I was, from that position, looking to understand what life looked like on the other side of the scale dime, and also to be a central part of that sort of explosion in how storytelling is happening using this medium. Hence where I am today.
That's interesting. I think you and I have talked. I also came out with a film degree and saw a number of the transitions you're talking about. Got an MBA and became worthless as a creative, or at least that's what a friend said. But I had a fascinating conversation in Burlingame, California, just the other night about comb filters, because it was one of the guys who had been early on with Sony with, as he called it, beta, because he's from Oxford. And just how those kinds of technology sort of set the precursor, and why we're still stuck with things like 1080i interlacing and having to deal with that in the world of progressive streaming. So fascinating. All right. So we had a couple topics we had talked about. Let's see, Dom, I think you may have audio from.
Yeah, I think if you can still hear my audio, I'm having a little camera problem here, so might just have to keep it running on fiddle with wires here. So classic webcast.
And actually, Dom, I think if you can move back audio yours completely for just a moment, that's possible. There we go. So Sangeeta, one of the topics I think we talked about early on before the show was sort of the use of cloud for e-gaming and cloud gaming. Can you expand a little bit on that? I had to step away, so I wasn't part of that conversation.
Sure thing. So gaming traditionally has been about either buying a console in the home and playing on it, or buying an expensive PC rig or a PC gaming PC, spending maybe $1,000, $2,000 and keeping it updated every couple of years with the latest graphics cards, and then playing games. Now, more recently, there has been a lot of buzz around cloud gaming, where actually the game rendering happens in the cloud. So the game engine really doesn't run in your home, but it actually runs in the cloud. And the resultant frames, the video, is then compressed and transmitted to the home. So you can play on any laptop, on a Mac, on a PC, on a lightweight device. You don't need a heavy client anymore. So, and Google just announced Google Stream, their Project Stream, which is the latest cloud gaming incarnation. NVIDIA is in beta. There are a number of startups in this space. This space was hot about 3 or 4 years ago. And then On Live was very popular then. And then it came to a crashing end when latency being the biggest issue. Bandwidth has gone up significantly, every year. So that's no longer really as much of a problem. Latency, I think, remains to be seen, and the latency requirements for gaming are quite stringent. And so that's where that's where things rest now, in the sense of whether the latency of the network is low enough to support gaming or not.
So it's interesting because back probably 10 years ago, Unity, when that engine first came out, their idea was you could, rather than downloading an entire map before you played, you would actually download the textures for the portion of the map that you were in. So they had the idea of streaming media as opposed to streaming video. That model, of course, requires lower bandwidth at some times and higher bandwidth at other. What you're describing, it sounds like, is sort of having consistent bandwidth as the frames are streamed at a particular data rate, rather than having variability that Unity was like.
But of course, as those of us who've been in video for a while know, the particular data rate even for video is not fixed. It may vary depending on the complexity of the frame, depending on how much motion there is, what else is happening, and so on and so forth. But to me, it's an interesting pivot from traditional streaming media, where people are watching, cat videos, to watching professionally developed content like Netflix, to Twitch, which was about e-gaming, watching other people play, which took me a little while to understand.
Well, Justin started that as live casting of himself, and it ultimately became just watching him play video games. So
Right. And funnily, e-gaming apparently has led to a rise in PC gaming, because people watch that the best Twitch players happen to be playing on PCs versus consoles. So funnily, with all this move away from PCs, actually gaming has moved more towards PCs. But the latest incarnation, I think 2019 is probably going to be a banner year for cloud gaming, and that's going to bring a lot of bandwidth to the network. So we'll have to see how that pans out, both for consumers and for network operators.
And some of the consoles had in-game streaming. Is that also being offloaded to the cloud, or will that primarily continue to be generated from within the game? Because it's only limited to a certain number of titles, but I know that was an attempt.
Yeah. I suspect anything that happened in the game, it just so happens that the game, instead of running on your heavy PC at home, is going to run in the cloud. So I suspect any functions that resided with the game are going to move to the cloud, because that's the point that they've said, oh, we don't need a big device in the home. And the other change that's happening, which is not technical, is perhaps a subscription model. That is, are you going to go out and spend $1,000 for a PC, or are you going to sign up for a $20 a month or some such service fee, which, thanks to Netflix and everything else, they have clearly made that a successful model, right? The subscription model. So that's not a technical change, but that's the associated change that's happening.
And it's interesting you mentioned that about the size of the device in the home, because if we think back to the old, I mentioned Scientific Atlanta, if we think back to the old cable set-top boxes, fairly large, fairly bulky. Over the last couple of years, what we've essentially done is a single big box in the home, and then DTAs that sit, smaller boxes that sit around. Right. In some ways, what you're suggesting is the big box sits at the center of the network, and the DTAs themselves, just to receive the stream, sit in the home.
Right. And the other advantage with this is, if all you're doing is streaming video, there are plenty of devices in the home which know how to stream video, whether it be a Roku or maybe an Apple TV or, your laptop, or maybe it'll come even to a Chromecast, I don't know, but, there are plenty of devices. So I see that the whole cloud gaming space, to me, is following the trajectory of the streaming media space. And not only as a that it's following that trajectory, but also that the technologies that it's going to leverage are in fact actually overlapping quite a bit with streaming media. What is the transport you want to use? How do you get to low latency? How do you do good encode, but low latency encode? If we thought live encode was a challenge, think about encoding it frame by frame so that you can get it back to the user within 100 milliseconds. We're talking about a keystroke in the home to going back to the cloud, rendering, coming back within 100 milliseconds, right? So now it's like streaming media on steroids in terms of technologies. So.
And it's like this technology here with Hangouts, where it's potentially it could be bidirectional with feedback from clients. Yes. And we know that things like WebRTC don't really scale very well. So we're in that same issue from a decade ago, where how do we do something low latency and still scale it?
How to scale it, and then the definition of latency is continuously changing, because for Google Hangouts, kind of latency maybe 200, 300 milliseconds may be okay. For gaming, they ideally want it to be under 100, maybe 50, 60 milliseconds. So it's pushing the limit. And of course, around the corner, maybe AR and VR, which claim you need below 20 milliseconds from head movement to the display updating. So that line is being pushed continuously in terms of what is needed. And also that means that the transport will have to change. For streaming media, we've been happy enough with TCP because we've basically declared streaming media to be small file downloads, continuous downloads of lots of small files. And TCP has had its run for 20 plus years now, almost 30 years now. And of course, recently there's work on Quick and other things happening, again, in the streaming media space. Now there's a question of what is going to be the streaming media technology, or what is the transport, in fact, going to be. There is work in IETF in the area of L4S, which is low latency, basically a low latency transport. So there's a lot of work happening in this space. So I think there's, at least as a technologist, to me, this space is pretty interesting, that just as we think we're reaching, good levels of latency for streaming media, here comes another application which needs to do 10x better, perhaps, to kind of oversimplify the problem.
So before I drop over to Rory, just can you talk about L4S a little bit? I'm not familiar with that. Is it sort of a combination of UDP and TCP strengths, or how does it work?
So L4S has some pretty aggressive goals on how to reduce latency down to in the order of a millisecond. So we're talking about a completely different range. Like for most video streaming, we talk about sub-second as a good low latency solution. There it's about getting down to a couple of milliseconds. Some people want to get down to 1 millisecond, and others think even a few is okay. And oftentimes what happens, at least from a networking vendor perspective, is the buffering and the congestion that happens. How do we ensure that these low latency flows don't get stuck behind somebody else's big file download? Or how do we make sure it doesn't get stuck behind somebody else's file download in the same home even, right? It's not so much even about one user and the other, but in my home, maybe I'm trying to do gaming, and maybe my husband is downloading, pictures or uploading pictures. We don't want the experience to be impacted. So that is the focus. And also 5G is targeting a low latency network. So all of those things are combining or conspiring to make a low latency transport important. Because if the network is good, but you don't have a good transport, it doesn't solve the problem.
Well, and even in Europe, one of the issues, of course, with deep packet inspection is the essential illegality of doing that, which it could be used for benefit, not only for harm, which is why it was sort of put the way that it was. That's fascinating. Rory, from a telco standpoint, both level 3 and now obviously as part of CenturyLink, what do you think about the gaming scenario?
Yeah, crucially, I was just going to echo something that Sangeeta was mentioning at the end there. It's all the same resources that both use cases are utilizing all the way along the journey of the delivery of that content. But when it comes to this particular part of my job, one of the things that interests me most is to consider how short a time interval it was ago that you would see the latest gaming release backed by a news reporter stood outside physical bricks and mortar with a queue of people queuing around the block, just so excited to get that piece of content, that game, and how quickly that's flipped, and how I think Sangeeta is absolutely correct in saying it's sort of a streaming use case long after streaming was pushing a similar flipping model. So whereas, you know, Love Film over here in the UK, later acquired by Amazon Instant Video, significantly shifted people's perceptions of something that you went to a shop and bought, first to something that you borrowed, and then to something that you just had access to at your fingertips. It's strange almost that gaming took so long to catch up with that, but it's happened now. All of the largest peaks on all of the major networks in the world are now gaming releases, and that's really sudden. And for a telco, one of the interesting things that you have to harmonize for there is people's expectations are exactly. It used to be that download was an asynchronous task that ran perhaps in the background to a foreground entertainment task that a network might be able to carry out. Now it's overlapping, and it's not overlapping in my world as a network provider. It's also overlapping, as Sangeeta says, in the home. So how many people have upgraded their ISP contract, you know, after years of going, I'll never need that. I'll never need 50 asynchronous or 50 synchronous. Now they're all going, oh yeah, sign me up straight away, because we've all hit that barrier where everything traverses the same utilization. The other really interesting points I'd say to Sangeeta's opening there is this concept of where transformation happens. So the cloud led with a centralization story. Over time, that story has become problematic from an architectural perspective, because so much of the way we interact with content is becoming latency specific. Therefore, everything's moving out to the edge. And Sangeeta speaking there about rendering. I remember being part of, for example, Adobe Anywhere, the product that Adobe had for a period of time, which was all around centralized render, using NVIDIA as an engine to remotely apply editorial changes to a centralized compute or graphics engine.
Yeah, that was
now
playback engine.
Yeah, absolutely. And now I'm in a world where I'm seeing presentations from streaming leads and telcos where they're talking about just-in-time packaging as close to the edge as possible. So we go around this circle, and it's because all of the requirements that get put on the same common infrastructure shift the onus of responsibility around the ecosystem. And it's sort of a really interesting place where we land.
So, Rory, question about that, sort of to the edge. You know, Dom's a strong proponent of multicast, and I really like the idea too, although the limited number of potential live channels you could watch at any one time was sort of a limiting factor in the early days. But if we're talking about something like this gaming scenario where on Twitch, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions of people watch the best gamers, is there a model on the network itself to essentially multicast that out to the edges, and then do those localized renders, whether it's with, you know, captions in a particular language, etc., or do we stick even internal to your networks out to the edge with a unicast model that's just, you know, ramped up with scale?
So I think multicast. So I'm not with Dom. I think multicast is certainly a
the last time we have him on, Tim. It's the last time we have him on.
I'm certainly. I can see the benefits of that to solve a specific problem, but I think another interesting angle of this is the idea of containerized edge environments, and how we split out the edge as a concept of just a proxy to an important thing which is behind it, to becoming the important thing in its own right. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about, right? It's about pushing. So we used to have rendering on the client. So Sangeeta says, you know, if you were building consoles, then you had a cycle time to build your product, sell it to people. Games designers would be building cooler games, which would need more power right on the device. We then said, let's try and centralize all that so that people can get the benefit of not having to go through that cycle. And now we're at a point where latency means that you can't centralize that. You need that same cycle, actually quicker than that cycle, to happen closer to people than it is now. And whilst not getting its feet stepped on by the next use case that's sitting alongside it. So I think the only way to do that is to find an architectural premise which decouples the edge as much as you can from the origin, and applies a different set of requirements to the edge, to not just be a ferry for the origin, but to be an independent value add into that chain. Whether it is rendering is an interesting case, because rendering pops up all over the chain in different architectural cycles. But there's millions of other different processes that we apply to video, that we apply to games, that we apply to all of the different things that go into streaming media that could notionally exist independent of origin.
I think when you start adding in,
Rory, that you made, cloud doesn't have to be centralized. The first thought that comes to mind is cloud as in AWS or GCP. That's in the cloud. That's the first thing that comes to mind. But I think in the last, I would say 2 to 3 years, the terminology is moving, where I think people are recognizing that there's public cloud, yes, which may be AWS or something, but then there may be instances where edge cloud makes more sense. So you're absolutely right. I think there is going to be a balance. Some applications are just fine running in the public cloud, truly centralized cloud. And then there's plenty of stuff that needs to run closer to the user, whether it be, for example, for gaming. I think although we talk about it moving away from the home, we're just talking about it literally moving away from the home. Doesn't mean it's, going to 2 data centers in the country. I suspect it's still going to be in the metro area, maybe even as close as the service provider edge. Not sure. I think it remains to be seen as to where it ends up settling. But I think there are service providers to play in the edge cloud space now.
So a few years ago, we built some proof of concept architectures, probably 2013, 14, which were looking, our philosophy, we're very microservices based, and our philosophy is you always try to move the function to where it's needed rather than bring the data to the function. And really, if the compute in the RAN was the same as the compute in the data center was the same as the compute in the exchange, wherever you place that compute capability, then I think in every use case, you should be trying to localize the function as close to where it's most efficiently optimized as possible. There shouldn't really be an architectural concept topologically of there being a center and an edge anymore. If you've got 2 users wanting to watch a particular transcode of a particular video, and you might as well encode that as damn near as close as you can to those 2 users. If there's no point in doing it the other side of the world, just because that's where you topologically think of that resource being. But architecturally, getting people to make that mindset that we have on-prem clouds with particular vendors or particular clients who are transcoding large national broadcast TV channels through our encoding cloud facility. And they ask us to put labels on various servers with the channel names on, so that when they show their clients around, they can come and put their hand on a particular server and say, this is the one that's encoding your channel, which is frankly smoke and mirrors. We actually did introduce a preferred server notion so that you could sort of say it's the one with the label on it, but it shouldn't make any difference to your architecture. It should be, I think this concept of physically locating your edge nearer the edge is a bit of a strange thing to do. It should be where it's most efficient at every single instantiation, and you should also be able to move that function mid-service. So if you have a mezzanine, we had a mezzanine flowing over a satellite, but when you only have one HLS 1 megabit user on the remote end of the satellite, why send a 20 megabit mezzanine over the satellite and use up all that bandwidth? You just do the encoding at the origin, at the uplink, and send the 1 megabit stream over the satellite. And then when your audience builds up, you change that whole dynamic and you move the function so that your transcoding is happening off the mezzanine at a remote location, because once you've got 2,000 people pulling a megabit, 20 megabit isn't efficient, and you can change that on the fly. But I think I think, you know, a small company like us doing fairly specialized things, I think we can hang around doing that sort of thing. I think getting that sort of architecture into a commoditizable model that people can actually buy, that procurement teams can swiftly architect against, is some way off yet, I think.
Dom, I want to bring up an interesting point. You mentioned having to put the labels on the servers, and throughout my career, and not just in streaming, but prior to that, doing AV integration and video conferencing and motion picture production. If we took a little camera somewhere in motion picture production, it didn't feel as legit as if we took a big camera. So what in that transition to digital video from Beta SP, we would literally carry a mini DV that shot really well, and we'd carry along a big camera. And then transition into the model of AV integration. I did a project in Boston for a company. It was probably $800,000 worth of gear to do video switching throughout this single building, but there were no blinking lights on it. And when the VP came through, he said, because we had it all behind glass so they could see the server racks, except the server racks didn't have any blinking lights. He said, there aren't enough blinking lights. So we went out that night, we bought Christmas lights. We drilled holes in little 1U panels, and we put them in and had them randomly blink. And he came back through the next day and he's like, looks much better. Rory made the comment. Rory made the comment about, you know, the cues for games and like that. And in fact, a friend of mine gave me a copy of Mortal Kombat that was the PC version from years ago, you know, the box. And those things are actually still fairly cherished by people who have played those games over the years. But the cues actually give us the ability to gauge as a society whether something is successful. And I do wonder if that model is changing, because as we know with streaming music, what we're finding is people are gaming the system by having their fans play the album continuously for 6 days after it's released, so that it counts for a certain number of sales. And I think those physical models are actually beneficial, and I wonder if we're not maybe going a little too extreme at this point and are going to come back to some form of hybrid approach on that. And that, I mean, that's just conjecture, but I think from a physiological standpoint, it's interesting that physical space is something we're trained to understand. In the digital space, we're not necessarily trained to understand what success is or not.
Yeah, it's funny. It reminds me, I think the cultural shifts between the pre-internet and the post-internet generation are quite pervasive over a lot of things, really. I think, you know, I've had the joys of working on our logo. This is going to sound like a tangent initially, chaps, but it's not that much of a tangent. The local village community are doing their annual play, and I'm sort of helping out and doing a bit of tech and sound and that sort of thing. And most of the cast are either under 15 or over 60, I would say, and they were having a real problem with trying to come up with a script that was shareable. You know, which for people who are used to writing with pen and paper, there was this whole issue of marking up a printed script, sharing that data, and then at the end of every rehearsal, trying to share all the marks that they'd made on their script and make sure everyone had them on sort of commonly on their script. So I thought, well, you know, why don't we just use a shared document, you know, a Google Doc? Fantastic. Everyone under 15 got it instantly and turned up at their next rehearsal with the Google Doc open on their phone. Everyone over 60 had absolutely no ability to deal with these kids looking at their phones on stage. They just thought they were sort of taking selfies and distracted and not concentrating on the play, without really digesting the fact that they were using a new technology in a very quick, interactive way, which was bringing a lot of benefits. But I think the hardest thing to deal with is where that technology doesn't have the maturity. It just doesn't have any defense at all. So when the play director, who is in her early 70s, was sort of saying, you know, you need to make a note in this, and what you can't write on your phones, can you? And as she was busily scribbling on her script, she couldn't get her head around the fact that the kids were actually directly editing the shared script, and any one of them would do it. And these, I think, these cultural transitions, that model applies equally for what you see in telecoms architecture. You know, you're trying to talk to a community of people who are who were born in a traditional broadcast environment, who do 1 + 1 on everything and have this absolute faith that they know what's going on because everything's nailed down and labeled, and they can touch it and they can bring the clients to it and show them to it. And it's still a brave new scary world when it's all virtualized and they haven't got a feel for it. And if they see anything that's remotely more complicated because it's immature coming in from this newer approach, they immediately slam it. Well, you can't put your hand on it. You can't just unplug it and turn it back on. You have to, and they'll find 1,000 reasons why the new technology isn't mature enough yet. But I don't think that over time, and I think increasingly in the internet generation, I think that that's more like a point of switching rather than a point of gradual transition. I think there's just a point in age, in psyche, in how you approach technology that you just go, okay, we're going to do it the new way. At the moment, I think the telcos are still exploring SDN, NFV, those type of strategies, containerization, how they can actually make architectures that work in a completely different way to how you might do them in a physical, nailed down way. You see a lot of pseudo microservices, which are just monoliths dropped into a Docker container. That is not a microservice. That is a monolith dropped in a Docker container, and it's far, far, far from being a microservices. It has none of the resilience. It has none of the flexibility that you might want to get. I'm being shouted at by a cat in my studio, so if you can hear that, I apologize. But anyway, I think culture is still weighing in heavily in these transitions.
And in fact, before we go on to the next question around VMAF, I just wanted to ask Rory and Sangeeta, culturally as consumers, was it easy for you to make the transition to from physical to non-physical, not having to go to the shop to buy a DVD, not having to go buy a magazine or a newspaper, or did you find yourself sort of struggling with that as well?
In my case, I think I found it very easy to transition from physical to virtual, buying spaces. I mean, I'm such a fan of Amazon. I remember when my daughter was 5 or 6, she made me this note saying, "My mom loves Amazon," and put it up in the family room. I'm like, this is embarrassing. But, just last year I was out at Target because my daughter, we'd forgotten to pick up a birthday gift for her friend's birthday party. And so we were in a rush. We couldn't order via Amazon, forgot to do it. Went to Target and I'm like, okay, this is confusing. Where do I find the reviews? How do I sort things? How do I find out, what is good? What is the age group? This is really confusing. So to me, the transition had happened so completely that after a few years of not having done that, it felt so inefficient to go to a store to find something, how to even choose something, used to reading reviews, age groups, filtering. None of that is possible. So, I mean, clearly Target could do better with that. I mean, I'm sure to combine both the physical and the virtual, but I think some of us, and each of us, I think, makes that switch in different applications quicker and slower than in others. And for me, that particular one was so complete that this was alien sort of to go into a store and actually buy something. So.
That's interesting. Rory, what about you?
Yeah, I'm conflicted. So you mentioned a friend who produced a physical artifact of an experience that he really liked when he was growing up. And I can see how that...
And in fact, that was given to me to be a gift for somebody else who had also had that physical experience.
Yeah. So for me, one of my biggest passions in life is music. So I've sort of wrestled with... I will say I love records. I'd always take a record over streaming. Now I can say publicly on this forum, it's a lie. I always stream. I hardly ever buy a record. And I think part of me rails against myself for doing that. I'm like, I wish I bought more records. But the convenience and...
The first step in acknowledging an addiction is actually admitting that there's an addiction. So
I think it's where it goes round the sort of merry-go-round is I perceived the lack of physical thing as a devaluation. And I think for a period of time it was. But now, if I objectively review my relationship with music in this particular case, it's been enriched by having access to a wider, more immediate degree of influences. I think my brain has had to change to accommodate how those influences hit quicker. And I think that's the thing that culture is getting its head around. People used to have the time, and this was enforced because you had to go and get something. You have the time to deeply engage with something. And this, I think this is true of music, but it's probably true of a lot of things that we now experience by clicking on a link or opening up an app. Now we don't have so much time to digest, review, think about that thing. It's one of the reasons why I love going to the movies, because everything stops for 90 minutes. Everything just stops. You turn off your phone, you're not allowed to have it. And but perhaps these musings will be completely like they're from a space capsule in 5 years' time, because it seems like my nostalgia is already very tenuous, which is interesting.
And I'll give you another place that time stopped. That was on airplanes. When you got on an airplane, there was no internet, etc. Now, in the last trip that I took, on the way out, there was internet. On the way back, there wasn't. And I found myself almost in that addictive thing of, oh, I can't be in contact. But then I realized why I've loved, as a 2 million mile traveler over the last 2 decades, I absolutely love those times where I can't be connected. I can look out the window, I can read, I can sleep or something like that. But it was like, oh, I'd gotten so used to being able to be connected on the plane that I didn't know how to stop and reflect.
And I think the balance of that. So, for example, there's reductive arguments on both sides. So there was a reductive argument that, hey, kids don't have any attention span anymore because of this thing called the internet. And then there was a really good point made against that, which is, no, they binge watch entire series of House of Cards in one go. That's more attention span than anyone has literally ever had for a TV show. I think
it's very true.
The confusion or the sensitivity is around, did people stop caring about stuff? And I think, to Dom's point, maybe that's a cultural barrier that people didn't understand. People continue to care about art, stories, music, whatever it might be, pretty deeply. It's still pretty culturally central to our existence. We just eat it up quicker than ever before. Maybe there's a balancing point between value and hunger. I don't know.
So that's actually, I'm going to jump on that as a bit of a segue point there. So we always end up with a lot of, just because a lot of the larger media outlets are promoting stories about cord cutting and about the transition between the traditional broadcast industry and the brave new world of the internet and streaming and so on. Numbers out last month is that there was a 50% annual growth in people streaming and so on, and you can see that reflected in, I'm actually sort of going to bump about 4 different articles from the Flipboard into one statement here, but basically that's seen a change in Hollywood. Originally they were a bit in the doldrums actually as streaming was emerging, but now the funding going into streaming focused output has just leapt in the last couple of years, and it's creating a whole load of innovative new ways to focus production and so on these binge watching audiences and get the cinematics much more set up for people who are going to watch something for like 15-hour sessions rather than for 2 hours or whatever it may be, and so on. We've also seen teens, as normal. We're getting reports about teens turning off cable. I'm sure you guys have got, well, I don't know actually if you guys have that sort of data, but certainly most broadcasters put out data about this point when teens are really switched onto mobile and so on, much more than big screen and so on. But there was one article which stood out, which I thought bucked the trend in the right way quite nicely, which talked about the golden age of streaming coming to an end. And actually with Walmart and AT&T and others suddenly all doing direct-to-consumer propositions, this whole problem of while everything was concentrated through YouTube and Netflix, then actually that was kind of good because you could go to one or two places, and finally the big problem that piracy had faced was discovery, and finally the discovery problem was solved. You were already at a search engine, you could search for the content, and it was therefore easy to engage the customer and take some money off them and close the ecosystem. But now, if you're going to have to search across 60 different providers to find the video content, and you know, if you're not an expert on film production history and you don't know which studio produces the animated movie you want to watch, do you go to Disney and sign up there, or do you go to Hulu, or do you go to Net? I have no idea. And so we could see the golden age actually having a sort of reflex on itself, and we might see yet another change as we get a million instead of having a million channels on one cable provider, we're going to have effectively a million cable providers now. And again, I think that'll cause attrition and change over time. I don't know. What are your thoughts, guys?
Yeah, and I think the meaning or the significance of cord cutting is also changing, right? You may be a cord cutter, but then you go subscribe to DirecTV Now. Is that a cord, or is that a cut cord? I mean, I'm not sure. The line is blurring there because it's still DirecTV, now owned by AT&T. Yes, it's delivered over the internet. So I think cord cutting, that term is probably going to evolve. It traditionally meant you were getting rid of your satellite TV or your cable TV service. But now, yes, it'll still be provided. It may be provided over IP, maybe a lighter package, maybe a larger package, I don't know. But at the end of the day, there seem to be now, especially for live, there is a move happening from one type of aggregators to another type of aggregators, whether it's Sling TV or DirecTV Now and others. So I think the definition changes. There are still aggregators. If you think about it, Netflix itself was an aggregator. Maybe what it's allowed to aggregate is going to change over time, with Disney pulling out most of their content and Disney offering their own version of their aggregation of all their studios. Again, a lot of people don't realize that they think Disney is just the kids' movies, right? Even at work, I talk to friends and then they say, yeah, Disney, no, that's only for kids. No, they own a bunch of other studios which have a lot of content
ESPN,
that you can watch. Exactly. Yeah. So I think the terminology is going to change. At the end of the day, we need good discovery. We need good ability to reach content. Yes, the technology being used to deliver the content is definitely changing. But I'm sure that's not what average consumer on the street is thinking about when they're doing cord cutting. It's more about reducing their bill, maybe getting rid of content that they don't want to watch, and watching it on devices that they care about. At least that's my
totally agree with that.
So
cool. Tim, yeah.
I'm down to the end. We've got two acronyms that came up on the list that I think we ought to talk about. They both end in math. One of them, though, is CMAF, and the other is VMAF. And Sangeeta, let's talk about VMAF, because that's the whole quality analytics around video is really interesting. And Rory, obviously, you can chime in on that. And then we'll switch up and we'll talk about CMAF with you, Rory, first, and come back to Sangeeta.
Yeah, I mean, VMAF is actually a great development. I myself have been passionate about video quality and video quality of experience, led a project in that area for the last few years at Cisco, quality of experience analytics and optimization. And it basically goes back to the principle that if you want to improve something, it'll be good to be able to measure it, because if you can measure it, then you can improve it. So at that time, even for our own project, I spent a lot of time thinking, should we go build a quality metric? And I used to joke that I want to build the rest of it so that if a quality metric came in, I can actually use it and, improve it. At that particular time, just because of investment funding, we didn't have the funding to go invest too much in it. But interestingly, someone from the Scientific Atlanta side did come up with a metric. So I was like, this is funny. I didn't know about that work when I said someone will walk in one day and tell me they have a metric. So it was just a lucky coincidence. And so we were using that. This was the days before VMAF. So we did some work on that. We, in fact, also worked with some of the same professors and universities that Netflix talks about in VMAF. But the bottom line principle is, if you can measure something, then you can worry about how to optimize it. A lot of the work that's being done today in the industry is about optimization, whether it's optimizing your route for Waze, or it's optimizing your network route with analytics, or it's optimizing the quality. All of this is about, if you have a metric, we can measure it. How to do A/B testing. How do you convince yourself that this change you made in the codec is better than the old version that you had? Previously, it was all about golden eyes. You would have a handful of people who were experts at seeing things, and then you would ask them, did this make it better or did it make it worse? And that was always challenging because, yes, you had a handful of experts who knew where to look to identify problems. But the flip side is, does the average consumer care about those slight differentials that a golden eye person can actually see? So that's always been a holy grail, I would say, for almost 20 plus years that I've been involved in the video industry, coming up with a good metric that mimics human perception has always been a challenge. We've always used mean square error and peak signal to noise ratio, which were easy to compute and easy to spot the differences. But as consumers, we don't have the original video and the compressed video to look at in our homes. We just look at one version of the video. We don't go spotting the differences. Oh, that pixel went up and this pixel darkened. So I think VMAF is actually a great effort. It helps define an objective metric. Now that you have the metric, I think the question is, what are the different companies going to do with it? I think there's a lot of interesting things you can do. Netflix is doing it, especially for video on demand. Remains to be seen if people put it to good use for live video, which you don't have the choice of encoding things 10 times and making a selection. Like in VOD, you do have the time. But I think it's still a good metric to have. So think of VMAF basically as a objective measure of quality, which we didn't have till we didn't have a good one so far in the industry, and now we seem to have.
I'll add something before Rory steps in here, but on one hand, I agree we don't, as consumers, have the A/B comparison to do, mean square, etc. But I think what's interesting with some content, especially content that we say own on Blu-ray or we own on DVD, we know what the quality of that was before. And the moment that we see it on Netflix or Hulu or what have you, and especially in those first 5 seconds where it starts up at the lowest data rate, we're like, this is going to be a really crappy experience. And then it improves. But right. I do think consumers have some level of that knowledge with things that they've either seen in the theater or seen on a traditional medium. But you're absolutely right. This one seems to get us really close to what would typically be the golden eye approach.
Yeah.
Rory, your take?
Yeah, it's interesting, listening to Sangeeta talk. I was put in mind of, I put forward CMAF, but really it was around standards. And as I drilled deeper into it, listening to this idea of quality, there's a conflict. As a consumer, I'm driving a conflict. I want a greater degree of flexibility than I have ever had in interacting with content, and I want it to all be consistent. I want total parity in experience between the Blu-ray and the phone that I'm using in a field somewhere. And I was thinking about how that was seeded in my life. So going back to Mortal Kombat as the anchor for this discussion, the Sega Game Gear was my favorite thing when I was a kid. And someone said, did you know you could get an aerial, you plug in the cartridge, and you get TV from your from your TV, it magically goes onto your Game Gear. So you could go theoretically anywhere you want and you could watch TV using this aerial. And I was so excited, and for about 3 Christmases I asked for it, and eventually I got it. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I'm going to be able to watch TV anywhere I want in the house. And it was rubbish. You had to stand like on one leg in the corner of the kitchen to watch something.
Foil and hold it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I was really like, even at that stage, which is relatively immature in this whole story of streaming, I was like, oh, that's really disappointing. How couldn't they figure that out? And fast forward a number of years later, the compelling use case, which drove me as a consumer to buy the internet television service of a large sports broadcaster in the UK, I'm rarely in front of my TV when my favorite team's playing. I'm often in a car, in the passenger seat in this case, but traveling somewhere, going somewhere, doing something. I can get that game on my phone, and in a way that it wouldn't have done a couple of years ago, it works. The stream is constant, it's consistent. There's no dropouts. I'm pushing it hard because I'm sometimes, you know, far away from built up metropolitan areas, but it works. And that's sort of I think you're right, Tim, in that we innately as consumers have had quality of experience seeded by very different technologies with very different architectural dependencies, which we apply completely unfairly to this new model of engagement. Like, we have absolutely no right to say, okay, Mr. Engineer, we used to have a very fixed variable, which was the television, and you used to build for that. I want to give you 1,000 variables and have you make it better than it was on the television. And the engineer would say, God, that's going to be a big project. But
well,
that's what I want.
Provided a use case for that makes sense. I mean, if you're watching your favorite football match, you're not looking at the quality of the encode on the grass. You're looking at the quality of the encode on somebody's face and the goal to make sure that it was made. With the on-demand content that we watch consistently, whether it's, I don't know, The Princess Bride or Doctor Who or, you know, some other movie, we have had an experience there that we do expect it to come up to the same level.
I agree. I guess my subtle mulling over that, my subtle augment to that would be, all of us innately have different measures of quality based on different use cases. So in that use case, my measure of quality is consistent buffer-free stream. That's very important to me. If the stream drops out, then I'm unhappy. You're right. If I'm watching a cinematic production, it's for it to be as close to the movie theater as possible. And going back to Sangeeta's point around trying to find commonality in how we measure and how we understand things to be good, it is really hard from an engineering perspective because consumers are outwitting the technology. Just in the same way that me and my friends when we were 5 were saying, oh, why doesn't this Game Gear work just like the TV? That's being driven by much smarter 5-year-olds now in ways that we can't imagine. So
I've got a good example of that. I'm not allowed to do any quality assessment within our company because I've been watching streaming for 25 years. And I love it when you get moving pixels. I don't care how blocky they are at all, but I'm just not allowed to give any opinion on video quality because I'm just stupidly pragmatic about it. And I came into the industry from that angle. So, and rightly so, you know, the people who are used to 4K TV, I don't believe in 4K. I will probably never need it, or I'll probably have to have a 4K TV purely because I won't be able to buy a TV that won't be 4K. But I only got rid of my CRT about 4 years ago because I love the depth of the colors, you know.
So Dom, I want to make one last comment around the Mortal Kombat thing. And this is to Rory's point. We've had quality of experience in those things. One of the reasons that 8-bit gaming, you know, comes back every so often is people have a nostalgia for that absolutely horrible looking, but, you know, culturally relevant part of it. So in that regard, having to render 8-bit games to look like 8-bit games as opposed to looking like something better is a reverse challenge in the whole model.
Now, I just have to quickly chip in. I wasn't watching the chat room, and Mark DJ's been in there chipping in bits for our conversation. We've missed them, but if you wanted to rewind and then sort of work out where he chipped in, he did comment that vinyl sales are going up again and telcos are aggregating content players. So well done, Mark, for making it to the chat room. And if you are tuned in, then next month do come back to the chat room. We're getting to the last couple of minutes. Sangeeta, I know you're going to be at Streaming Media West.
That's right.
Is that right? Which panels are you taking part in?
I'm on the panel related to machine learning and how that can be leveraged in the streaming media space. I believe that's on Tuesday, November 13th.
That's perfect. And in our warm-up conversation just before we went live with SMAF tonight, I was deeply overjoyed that Sangeeta was talking in depth about machine learning and didn't mention the dreaded AI acronym once. So keep your eyes on my View from the Edge articles in the magazine, because I am going to berate people who use the term AI shortly. But well done, Sangeeta. I look forward to that. I'll pop into that panel. Rory, are you making it to Streaming Media West?
No, I'm going to be engaged in an AI workshop. No.
Nicely done.
Well done. Well done. Dom often is not speechless, but here we have it.
No, I'm not going to make it out, unfortunately, but I will be at OTT TV World, CDN World.
And Content Delivery World, yeah.
Yep.
be there. So I'll see you there at the end of the month and just before our next edition, actually. So I'll be ready to round up how that all went there. Tim, what are you doing at Stream Media West? You've got about 15 panels, haven't you?
Yeah, I've got about 15 interviews right now with a number of new companies as well as a number of tried and true companies in the industry. I love doing those because they pay me to sit and talk to people that I either know or don't know and find out new stuff. And those will be live on Facebook and the Streaming Media Facebook page.
And they're always really good. They get drip fed out on repeat as well for months afterwards. So they're always worth watching out for, those ones. I'll be down there doing a panel on Tuesday, just after the keynote on OTT and microservice architecture. And then on day 2, I'll be taking my tie off, as if I ever worn, and I'll be doing a session following up my internet radio, 25 years of internet radio, pair of articles. Actually, the second one's just come out. So I've got Real, Napster, Sharpstream, and you'll have to forgive me, but I haven't written it down in front of me, and I forgot the other panel. But there's a great cluster of internet radio, old and new hands taking part in that panel session there. So I think we're right on the hour. Rory, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you later in the month, and but once again, thanks very much.
Thank you. Cheers all.
And Sangeeta, also thank you for joining us, and also without having to mention it, representing the Women in Streaming Media group as well. And we'll continue to make sure we positively bring more women into the shows in future. We've got Andy Beach and Peggy Mao joining us next month. So that's great as well. Tim, I will see you a couple of weeks on Monday at Streaming Media West, where, of course, you won't be drinking at all, and I will be drinking yours for you. And with that, I say good night, and thanks once again to our guests. That was SMAF.
Thank you.